I hope everyone had a great break, and really excited about the next session that we're bringing to you. This process of dealing with polarities is one of the most powerful tools that I've encountered in my work in leadership development and working with change. And we've got three terrific people today to share this methodology with us. And just briefly to introduce them. So Margaret Seidler is somebody I got to meet a number of years ago, and she's a retired OD professional and consultant, but she's also the author of a book called Power Surge, which is about the use of this methodology. And Margaret's doing a lot of work in the area of Charleston, South Carolina, which is about kind of creating healing, especially in the space of divides between communities and the police and communities. Chris Kayser, who's one of the principals of the Polarity Group, Polarity Partners, has got a lot of experience in terms of OD positions, working with a number of organizations like the Washington Post and the National Cooperative Bank, and also as a consultant with a company called Experience. And what's also intriguing about Chris's background is that he brings a practice of Eastern philosophy and Tai Chi and the martial arts into what he does. So perhaps you'll hear some of that today. And finally, to round us out is Chandra Irvin, who's the executive director of the Center for Peace and Spiritual Renewal at Spalding University. Again, you hear this connections between peace and spiritual renewal, right? Something that's really central to this community. And she's active at the university, but also in the city of Louisville in terms of applying restorative and spiritual practices to promote racial equity, healing, justice, and peace in community relations. And she steps into this as a strategist, a facilitator, and consultant, leveraging the polarity process. And the folks that are here today are doing some phenomenal work in communities, but a lot about this issue of race and also closing some of the really prevalent gaps that exist in America. So I'm really excited once again to have the honor to introduce these three folks and for the session that we're going to experience right now. So over to all of you.
Thank you so much, Lyndon. Okay, everybody's got the screen in front of them. Yes.
Yes, looks good.
Thank you. So this next 90 minutes is about the word and. And because I'm from the South, I can make that a 3-syllable word. And although it is a small word, I have found that it can be a game changer in addressing long-standing complex issues as well as in developing empathy. In our session, first, we'll share how Chandra and I applied or polarity thinking and allow you to imagine the experience that we provided to over 800 citizens in my hometown of Charleston, South Carolina. Here we provided each person an equal voice in shaping the future relationships between police and the citizens they serve. Later, Cliff is going to walk you through the theory and the methods that enabled us to engage a highly diverse parts of our community in shaping the future relationships. Most of you may know, the city of Charleston has a centuries-old history of racial tension, beginning with the transatlantic slave trade for centuries and ending with the domestic slave trade in 1865 at the end of the Civil War. This history just recently became deeply personal to me, and Robert mentioned genealogy just a minute ago on our break. In just 2018, a DNA test sent me in search of my family's history here. And shockingly, I learned that I, Margaret Seidler, am descended from 3 generations of slave traders. 90 years my family was in the business of human trafficking right here on the eastern coast of the United States. and they brokered the sale of more than 10,000 human beings. So I have devoted hundreds and hundreds of hours of research. And so I now not only understand my family's history here, I better understand the history of policing in Charleston, dating back to its fear of revolts by the enslaved and ending in what is today's racial inequities in policing. So what I want to do now is take you back in time. And I can't move my slide.
Try clicking right on the slide. That works for me sometimes.
Thank you, appreciate it, but a teammate. So this is June the 17th, 2015. This is the night that a young man in his early 20s decided that he wanted to start a race war. And he came to one of the most historic African-American churches in the United States, and that is Mother Emanuel African-American Episcopal Church in downtown Charleston. And he massacred, killed 9 human beings while they had their eyes closed and were praying at the closing prayer of a Bible study. And in the center, you'll see this was the first press conference that happened late that night. And this is our former police chief, Greg Mullen. And this is our former mayor, Joseph P. Riley. He'd been our mayor at that point for about 38 years. Chief had been here for about 7 years at this point. But Chief Mullen came out and he said, what has occurred in Charleston is a hate crime. And what I want you to notice is that there are lots of African-Americans standing behind Chief Mullen, and those are people that he had a very close relationship with. One is Reverend John Paul Brown, who was at that time the minister of the sister AME church to Mother Emanuel. So let me take you just even a step farther back in time. So how did this come about that the chief of police in Charleston, South Carolina, had that kind of support the night of something that was so unimaginable and so horrific? Well, I met Chief Mullen in 2010, so 5 years earlier. Although I was working around the country, I've always given close love and attention to my own hometown. And I met the police chief through some things I was doing in the community. And he asked me to stop by his office, and we looked at the strategic goal that he had of enhancing community safety. He said that was the ultimate thing he wanted to achieve. And so as we looked at it, and I taught him about polarity thinking and about the power of that little word, and he saw that it was definitely the police's responsibility to always enforce the laws and make sure that they maintained the support of the community, that it wasn't one or the other, that it was in fact enforce the laws and be close to the community. So in 2010, his command staff, which was about 50 people at that time, they drove a focus across all police officers to develop relationships and get involved in a community engagement process in many different ways, in higher crime areas and in less advantaged areas. And, you know, police getting out of their cars, they worked with faith clergy, they worked with local nonprofits, and very importantly, they worked with community activists. And so all those relationships were in place the night of that massacre. So after the massacre, and believe you me, it was emotional here for months. Chief Mullen and I had been talking about what would be something that a police chief could do given what was going on around the country in 2015 and also going on in our own backyard of the city of North Charleston, a separate municipality. What could we do to make sure that we honored those whose lives were taken, that they weren't taken in vain, that we honor the local activists who came down to Mother Emanuel that night with their cars filled with guns to get ready to get into war. And instead, they saw Chief Mullen, they talked, and he says, look, I've got to have your help. I need everyone to just give me some time to sort this out. And so when people came from other parts of the country, these local activists were the ones who stood up and said, we want peace. We don't want rioting. And what Chief Mullen realized, the one thing that he had real control over was that he would be the one person that could seek input from all parts of the Charleston community to improve both citizen and police relationships. And we called it the Illumination Project. And earlier, Vanessa, when she first started off this morning, she was talking about shining a light on tension, shining a light on the need for equal voices. So I want to thank Vanessa for actually helping us figure out how to do the Illumination Project, even though we didn't know her. We were all thinking along the same lines. So what the project was about getting people from different communities, very different communities, people that would probably never run into each other anywhere, sitting down at a table in a facilitated discussion and talking to each other about what would be some realistic ideas of things that we could do to strengthen citizen-police relationships. And what we made clear was we wanted to make sure that in this process, when we went public, that the actions would help community members feel like the police procedures were fair and just, that they'd been heard, they'd been treated with respect and dignity, and that if police action were taken against them in the future, that they would understand the why, even though they might not like it. For those of you who've ever done work in the police community in this country, these are what are pretty much termed procedural justice principles. So we got ready for several months before we went public. We started the project just months after the massacre. So we were up and running in September of 2015, and the project ran for an entire year. We spent the first about 5 months, Chandra and Jake Jacobs and I spent about the first 5 months getting the community ready for having very, very serious and open dialogue and telling the police what they think they could do and how they could be better in the community. So while we started in September, we did not go public until March. So we spent the first few months working with about 100 what we call community influencers, a steering group and community influencers. And we worked to find common ground. We worked to figure out how we could get into that part of the community that they were closest to. I mean, so if you look at me, I'm almost 70 years old, I'm white, I'm female. There are definitely areas that I can get in that are different than, and I'll show you, like Lisa Rahim, who's here, and then Diane Hamilton, different parts of the community that they could reach that I couldn't reach, and vice versa. One of the things that really helped us out, and I did not take this for granted, because the local NAACP had been very critical of our police department in times prior. Going through the both and thinking process, Dot Scott, who was head of the local chapter and still is, worked really hard to see the potential that this process brought for bringing people together and exploring their differing views, their differing life experiences, and all would have that equal presence. So when we finally went out to the public in March of 2016, to what we call the heart of the process, which were our listening sessions, we actually were receiving ideas about what police and citizens could do now to improve relationships. And that's a picture of Bianca Anderson, and she was one of our youth facilitators, because we also knew that the bigger demographic that we could have covered, like she was going into high schools for us, And we knew that high schools would be a lot more open to someone like Bianca than someone who looked like me. So what we did in a listening session is we set some parameters. We had people at small table groups. We had a facilitator. We had over 40 group facilitators, so facilitator every table. And so for the purposes of the session, this was a definition of public safety that we gave the group to work from, which we define public safety as a combination of effective policing services and citizen involvement that creates a safe, secure, and livable city. And at this point, I asked those who were in favor of public safety to please raise their hand. And we'd either have anywhere from like 20 to maybe 70 or 80 people in the room. And so they'd raise their hand, say, great, I'm glad you're for public safety. And then I said, now this is the other definition that we're going to work with. And this is our definition for the project of individual rights. And this is the ability for people, regardless of their individual circumstances, positions, or authority, to be treated with fairness, equity, dignity, and respect based on the rights and freedoms that are described in our US Constitution and related laws and customs. And then I said, so how many of you are in favor of individual rights? Please raise your hand. And I said, well, great. Now, some of you didn't raise your hand for public safety. Some of you didn't raise your hand for individual rights, and that's okay. Because what we're gonna do is we're gonna all just imagine for the next few minutes that we're all in graduate school. We've all got our college degree. We're in graduate school. This is the only place in the United States this is taught, and you're gonna be taught it right here today in the Illumination Project. We call this polarity thinking. And this is a polarity map. And the best part of this polarity map is this little tiny word in the center called and. So regardless of whether you said you favored public safety, or whether you said you favored individual rights, or whether you said you liked them both equally, everybody's correct. What we know is that public safety and individual rights are both necessary over time if we, in fact, want to build trusted relationships between our community and our police department. Now, how many of you in the room want to, in fact, create those trusted relationships? And all the hands went up. Every single hand went up. We could all agree that that was something that was important. And then I went to this bottom circle and I said, how many of you want to see communities and policing where we are divided and distrustful? And everybody shook their heads no. And I said, well, the beauty of this is that we can get very positive things when we focus on public safety. We get enforcement of the laws, reduces crime, we maintain safety of the community by law enforcement, and it builds community trust. I said, but imagine if all we did here in Charleston was we said public safety is the answer, and we're not going to do anything to spend any time with honoring people's individual rights. And I said, well, let me just tell you what is strong, what makes us strong from focusing on public safety can turn into a negative if we neglect to focus on individual rights. So we could see if all we did was public safety over time, there might be a disrespect of the rights of some people. Some people might feel invisible. We might feel that individual safety is compromised. And you could just see a certain portion of the people in the audience, in that room, at their tables, shaking their heads in agreement. And they're going, that's where we are now. And I said, right. Some groups are feeling disrespected. So what we know is, if we come up here to the positives of a focus on individual rights, the answer to that, the solution to that is that we focus on individual rights and we have law enforcement respecting the rights of all individuals, regardless of the community, that we maintain the safety of individuals. And they're like, yes, yes, yes. And I said, so let's consider this. What if we said, okay, we're just going to focus on individual rights in the city of Charleston. We just don't think that public safety is important. We're just going to let that stay alone because we've already focused on that before. But what I'm going to suggest is there are going to be some equally negative things that are just very different that we would get if, in fact, we only focused on individual rights and neglected a focus on public safety over time. And they read that and everybody got it. And what I know is that I had people in those rooms, or that we had people in those rooms with, they were in the 7th grade. Some had a 7th grade education. Some had PhDs. What I know is everybody understood this because we were all experiencing the tension and the conflict that comes between public safety and individual rights. So what happened here is that everybody felt like they kind of had a place to stand, that, yeah, I see that point of view, and I also see the other point of view, maybe for the first time. And with that more whole awareness, we went into the real work of the sessions, which was to ask them what suggestions they had for police. This is a police chief asking the citizens to tell them, what do they need to start doing, stop doing, keep doing, or do more of? Any of those. Then we asked, in the next part of the session, those same questions for citizens. If what we want to do is safeguard individual rights and preserve public safety. And from those answers, 2 table groups worked together. They posted their ideas on a flip chart, and then they did multi-voting to, in fact, roll up what were the priorities from that night's session. So the reach that we had over about 5 months was 33 90-minute sessions, 858 people, including 290 youth, over 2,200 ideas and comments, which, believe it or not, they were almost evenly split between things that police could do better and things that citizens could do better. So what I realized was that if you give people the voice, they will be honest that they have some skin in the game and need to do some things as well. And from that came 86 strategies, all to be measured and implemented over time. We also had researchers doing some baseline research as well, and had over 1,000 surveys conducted. So to say what really happened in terms of something bigger than people giving ideas that have been implemented and remain being implemented is that we were building respectful relationships. And what it has done is it has opened the door for healing across our community. And the way we did that was we made sure that people were introduced to their table groups, that they got to share their hopes and concerns about what was going on. We used the max mix process of not letting people sit next to their best friends. They were assigned tables by numbers. In many cases, we served just like a light snack during the table work introductions so that they could, in fact, get to know each other. And what we have seen all these years later are some fairly unimagined, deep and lasting relationships. So one of my husband Bob's and our best friend is a man named Papa Smurf, and he served 10 years in prison for drug dealing and guns and that sort of thing. And he's been out 20 years, but he came to one of our very first sessions because he knew Chief Mullen, and he challenged us on everything we were doing. And all of a sudden it just dawned on him that this was his hope of having his voice heard. And he became one of our acolytes. I mean, he just became a person who brought, he called them Nuck Nuck and Pookie to the table and got people really talking about it. And to this day, Papa Smurf and his family, comes to our house for dinner, and we go on trips together. And I'm just one of many, many examples of those relationships that have happened. And it all happened because no matter what your point of view, whether you valued public safety and you didn't want to see this done, or whether you valued individual rights, we all had a voice, we all had a place to stand. And what this did was it gave people a chance to be heard in a way they'd never been heard before. They weren't getting patted on the head. Their ideas were going to be used. It also, by being heard, it reduced their resistance. And I think it also lessened some bitterness that people brought to the table. In 2019, there was a police audit done in addition to the Illumination Project. And it was just so fantastic to see that almost all the police audit recommendations closely aligned and or overlapped with our 86 strategies. And there's something that I've always been taught, that the wisdom exists within the people who live inside the system needing improvement. And that is what we saw happen, is that we used the process of polarity thinking to help draw that wisdom out in a way where people were willing to speak. So just a couple of weeks ago, I was excited to see this in our newspaper, the Post and Courier here in Charleston. He interviewed our mayor, John Tecklenburg, who's been mayor for about 5 years now. And this was part of the mayor's response to this whole notion of defunding the police. He said the city is putting $50 million toward affordable housing, and the police just opened a new substation and, very importantly, a gathering center in Gadsden Green to better interact with the public. And that they have increased community policing, and they've hired advocates for both victims and the homeless. And he said, because there's always room for improvement, the mayor says the city continues to implement the Illumination Project, a city-led effort to improve community relationships while respecting individual rights and promoting public safety. And I will tell you, to read that in the newspaper 5 years later, and the "and" was italicized in the newspaper, made me realize that we are at least making a positive difference for the people who have engaged and care about our community. So what I'm going to ask you all to do right now is to go into a breakout group, and then we'll come back together and here. And this, you just be on breakout. I think there are going to be about 5 of you in a group. We're just going to break out for 8 minutes. What I'm going to do very quickly is just someone volunteer to be a /reporter. And when we come back in 8 minutes, I just want you to share the themes from your breakout group in the chat so we can just debrief it. So here's the question that I'm posing for you all to talk about. What do you see, based on what I've said and shared with you about what Chandra and I did, what do you see as the supports and the barriers for leveraging public safety and individual rights in your communities? What do you see as the supports as well as the barriers for actually leveraging the polarity, public safety, and individual rights in your communities? So I think we were asking folks if you could just type some overall themes that you discussed in terms of supports or barriers for leveraging this whole public safety, individual rights with police and citizens. Just put that in the chat. We'll just have a couple of minutes for that. Barriers, mistrust. Definitely. Yeah, you have got to start slow to go fast. I mean, check power. Someone mentioned resistance to change. That's one of the things that this whole notion of, and Cliff will cover this, about polarity thinking, is how it addresses resistance to change and actually can tap the resistance as an energy source for change. Unchecked power. I really think that I've worked with police now for so long. I just feel that the key one that they've got to manage is authority and grace. Respect for the law and respect for people. Class disparities. Violence. Oh, interesting. Someone says, as adults tend to put the onus on the youth or younger generations without giving them the tools. I've got to say this, and Chandra, I know you agree with me when I say this, that of the 2,200 ideas that we got, I would say the top 15 ideas came from high schoolers.
Wow.
No kidding. And we went back to one of the groups that we worked with in one of the high schools early on, and we said, we want to come back and show you what's already being implemented, because the chief said if there were things that he didn't have to wait for, he could just do now, he did. And then they started getting us invited to other youth groups. It was, I'm gonna tell you, the do not do not undersell the potential of high school youth an answer. So I definitely agree with that.
The other part of that was that adults don't necessarily welcome them to the table. And to your point, they have so many fantastic ideas, or maybe they're more immersed in it. And
Yes.
and here we are, we're telling them to solve for a problem, but then we don't want to hear them.
Right. And what was key too was having these, we had all these youth facilitators that we trained, and I mean, that really helped too. Yeah, do not underestimate the youth. Political barriers. I will tell you that the hardest thing to do is to keep this out of the political arena. And I think with that, Cliff, is there anything else you want to add, Chandra or Cliff, to these comments that are coming in? Because I'm going to sign off or sign to the side.
These are,
Cliff?
I mean, this is great. This is great stuff. And so much of it is really unique and contextual to, I'm sure, individual challenges in your communities. And we have heard some of this before. A lot of it is very, these are common themes, but there's a lot of also very rich, unique information here too. So thank you all for your time. I know it probably felt very short. I know that was the case in my breakout room.
Well, Cliff, I think it's really important for you to take us forward, because what we've shown you this part is really just the practical application. And Cliff is going to do the theory and the methods behind what Chandra and Jake and I did in Charleston. So Cliff, take it away.
Great. Thanks, Margaret. Yeah, I was just going to say, we jumped right into theory or practice, and I'm going to loop back to the theory portion of it, and then we're going to loop right back to practice and give you a chance to do a little practice of your own. When we talk about repair and leading to repair, and what are the first steps, and how do we face our fears, and what does bravery and courage look like? I mean, those are big issues, and sometimes it really just knowing where do you start? And I think this is a great process. Margaret talked about going slow to go fast. I'm gonna supplement that by saying start small to go big. And so we're going to learn the small process, and in that process of learning, seeing, mapping, assessing, learning, and leveraging, that's the small process. We're going to dive into a little deeper of a piece of the theory around what are polarities, why learn about them, why are they important, and how do you leverage them? So let's jump in. Here's a quick and easy warm up. What is more critical to stay alive? I really need you to come up with the correct answer here. Is it better to inhale or exhale? And if you could just put your answer in the chat, I would really appreciate that. And we will look at what the correct answer is, because I know you're all a bunch of smart people here. So I know we're gonna zero in on this, and we're gonna get right down to the correct answer. All right, yeah. So you see. It's easy to have preferences. So if you said inhale, and it's easy to also say, wait a minute, this doesn't feel quite right. I'm not sure what to do here. And when you get into one of those, polarities, it's a conundrum where it's not an or, it's an and. So as Margaret said, it's easy to be right with a polarity. If you said inhale, you can be correct, because you don't want to be in the downside of not having enough oxygen. You need to get oxygen. But if you said exhale, you're also correct. You don't want too much carbon dioxide. You've got to exhale to get rid of that. So which is it? Well, it's not an or, it's an and. And I know this one's kind of almost insultingly easy to figure out at one level when we look at it, but just keep in mind that this happens with the bigger issues as well. And the deeper we get polarized around them, the more dysfunctional things get. So we have to look at, okay, is this a problem to solve, or is it a polarity to leverage? And when we look at it as a polarity, what it does, it's just completely, I mean, when Margaret said that and in the middle is so important, we can look at this differently. So the first step is seeing. We need to see that there's a benefit to inhale and a limitation. And there's a benefit to exhale and there's a limitation. And if we do both well over time, we'll stay alive. So not only do we have correctness, we've got completeness. And that is a nice combination to have, wouldn't you say? So this is the kind of the first step, the seeing step. And the seeing is enhanced by the mapping. So if we know we have a polarity, we can map it. And that's what Margaret did in her practice. And so, and she engaged the entire community in that process. So we use and thinking for these interdependencies that require and. So a polarity is an interdependent pair. An example is inhale and exhale. There are benefits that each pole provides. There are 2 poles to a polarity, and each pole provides a benefit. Each pole has a limitation, and when you leverage the upside benefits, you can achieve a greater purpose, like staying alive. All right, so that's probably good enough for now, just in the seeing and a quick mapping on something really simple. So here's the 5-step small process, just so you can see it. And what I want to tip my hat, or maybe even give a virtual high five to Margaret for, is this thing on the far right, engage key stakeholders. Margaret brought a diverse group of key stakeholders together to see the tension more completely. And that's not an easy task. I mean, that task alone is huge, but she did it. She also differentiated problems from polarities. Just so you know, problem solving is good, and its upside. I mean, you know, do I stay or leave? You know, I make a decision, I solve the problem, bingo, I'm gone, or whatever, or I stay. If it's a polarity, we actually need both. And here's the beautiful thing about polarities, real quick. If you don't take anything away from my piece here, remember this. There's a beautiful predictability about them. So they all work kind of the same way when you're looking at an interdependent pair polarity. You've got a benefit to activity, a limitation to activity without rest. You got a benefit to rest. You've got a limitation to rest without activity. I mean, it's just like inhale and exhale. It's just maybe a little different context and a little different maybe time frame, etc. So we need to solve problems, and we need to solve or to leverage polarities. And I'm not trying to like get too out of hand here on the theory, but or thinking and thinking, problem solving is, you guessed it, a polarity. So we need both types of thinking. We need the genius of or thinking that solves problems. We also don't want to oversimplify these problems or misapply or thinking. So that could be a downside of or thinking without and thinking. There's a benefit to and thinking, because if we can see what the polarities are, we can then map them out and go through a process of leveraging them. But we don't want to try to turn everything into a polarity, because that just overcomplicates things and frustrates people and creates a bunch of confusion. So it's actually sometimes a tough needle to thread about what are the problems to solve and what are the polarities to leverage. But that's essentially what we're doing. And so this is a competency this thinking competency is one that each of us needs to leverage. So when you think about the relationship between communities and police in your community and in the nation, just put in the chat, what is your preference? When you think about maybe difficulties or whatever, do we need to tell the truth or do we need reconciliation? Well, you're probably on to my little false choice here. So what we're gonna do is I'm gonna take this off share, and actually, I'm going to take it off share for just a minute, then I'm going to reshare, because we're going to map this in real time. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at what are the upside benefits of the truth poll, where you're engaging key stakeholders about speaking the truth of their experience. So start thinking about that right now. What are the benefits of truth? And then what are the benefits of reconciliation? And here's where the polarity map is really helpful as we apply this to this different tension. What would be the downside limitations that could result from over-focusing on truth to the neglect of reconciliation? So what could possibly be wrong with truth? Well, truth without reconciliation could lead to some real negatives. And I want to tap your wisdom here to figure out what they are. And then what are the limitations of over-focusing on reconciliation without the truth-telling part? So now we can identify a few of those things. So that's what we're going to do right now. And we're going to do it in the chat very, very quickly. I'm going to show you, it doesn't take long to map one of these polarities. So first I'm going to stop share. Then I'm going to take this out of my show, and then I'm going to put it back in share screen so I can actually capture some of your content that you put into the chat. So we're gonna open up the chat here, and I'm asking now for what are some of the benefits of truth? When you think of the benefits of truth, what are some of the benefits? And Margaret, maybe you could perhaps just give me a sense of what the some of the things that we're hearing.
Okay. Problems
Help me capture.
Shared.
Upsides of truth.
Upsides of what?
Empathy.
Upsides of truth. Empathy.
People gain a new perspective, share real lived experience, validation, start to address issues, take ownership, common facts. Truth allows those who have felt disenfranchised to feel they are being heard. Yes, yes, yes. And affirmed. Respect.
Wow. You know what? There's so much good stuff here. I'm just realizing I can't capture it all. Look at the wisdom in the room.
Look
at the wisdom
right
in
there.
the room. If I tried to capture everything, we'd be here till the end of the session. So let's now move on to
Wow.
What are the upside benefits of reconciling? Like when you think about the benefits of reconciliation, what does that give you? And if you could read those, I'm not going to type because it's taking me too long.
Peace. Challenging your version of the truth, connection, healing, harmony, authenticity, optimism, unity, vision.
Yeah.
A brighter future, grace, possibilities, way forward, playfulness, refinement of my truth, forgiveness, future not past, understanding, strength. Oh my God.
This is great. This is great.
Expanded thinking. Imagine that. Expanded thinking.
Yeah. I love it. Now, here's where it gets interesting. And I want you to pay very close attention to this language that's in the downside, everyone. I'm going to make this a little bigger so everyone can see it. This is really important. I'm not asking you what's the downside of truth. I'm asking you, what are the limitations that might result from key stakeholders over focusing on truth to the neglect of reconciliation? I want you to put that in the chat. Yep.
He's stuck to the point.
Stuck to the point.
Creates conflict. My truth is right, limits possibilities, exclusion, illusion of certainty.
Look at this. Wow.
Set up for blame.
This is fantastic. Yeah.
I'm right and you're wrong. Over focusing on truth, divisiveness, lack of empathy. Yes. Tilt toward information overload or negativity, resentment, anger.
I just realized, and I wish I could type fast, because if I could capture all that, we could
rigidity, hatred. I win.
This is great stuff. I wish we could capture all of it and put it in this quadrant.
Perhaps we could do that as a follow-up. We'll have a record of the chat, I believe.
That'd be great.
And then we can do it, later on.
Beautiful. Yeah. All right. Now we're going to do the last piece. Same thing. What are the limitations that might result from key stakeholders over focusing on reconciliation without truth? So now, what could possibly be wrong with reconciliation? That's not the problem. It's reconciliation without truth. What would happen? Foolish expectation, misunderstanding the why, gloss over issues, too much, disingenuous. Look at that. Look at this stuff rolling in, Margaret.
Repetition of the same issues that cause the problems, can't move forward together. Boy, I'll tell you, these are some smart people on the call. Denial.
Yeah.
paralyzed.
Yeah.
That's the wrong problem.
Yeah.
Authenticity is compromised. But did you hear my pain?
Unequal.
Unequal, unending.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Hurt feelings.
Oh goodness. So, okay.
No justice,
so
no peace.
I'm going to go back to something here, and you all can keep adding to the chat if you want. There's nothing stopping you. I just want you to know that this tension isn't going away, especially for these big issues. And we're talking about these big, especially these big issues. When you're looking at truth and reconciliation, where you're talking about racism and sexism and genocide and poverty, systemic poverty, all these big issues, we've got to get square with that. How do we do it? Well, one way to start is to do exactly what you did, is to figure out what is the dynamic at play in this tension as we start to work together to unpack it. And so this has happened all over the world, the truth and reconciliation process, right? And I'm just trying to net this out with a little bit of content that might sort of capture some of the themes of your own content, just for kind of speed and to move us along. But think about the Nuremberg trials in Germany, you know, with that mainly focused on truth. Then you had the Chile after the Pinochet. So that focused more on amnesty. And so then Desmond Tutu in South Africa, he wrote a book called No Future Without Forgiveness. And they really recognized that how they needed to do this process that was unique for South Africa after apartheid. So this has been used all over the world. It's not easy. And it's critical to be aware of how this dynamic works going forward. None of us is above accountability, and none of us is below forgiveness. And that's the message I hope you'll take away from this is, how do we get ourselves in trouble with these tensions? Well, one way is to not see it as a polarity, and then you can get into one or both downsides. So that "and," as Margaret shared before, is really important. So this would be actually, let's play with this a little bit before I throw you into breakout groups. So this downside over here, look at this: diminishing impact, no ownership, no accountability. If you're there and you hang out in the truth pole, you may value the acknowledging the impact and the accountability side. And you feel like that's what's going to build the relationships between communities and police in this case. So that would be the fear and the value. So I want everyone to keep this in mind. There's a value-fear combination that's it's incredibly powerful, because there's a repulsion and an attraction to a certain pole that some people have because of their experience. Now, if you look at it from an "or" perspective, look how it gets you hooked. It gets you hooked and stuck in the tension. So how do we get hooked and stuck in truth? Right here. The fear of the diminished impact and no accountability, the value for the acknowledging the impact and accountability could lead to shaming and blaming and some of the stuff that we heard from you all in the chat. Oh my gosh, well, that's no good. That's not going to help us. That's actually causing a problem, and that problem it needs a solution. And so the reconciliation preference looks like this. Some people are hanging out on the reconciliation pole. They have a strong fear around this shaming and the inability to move forward. They value the grace and new possibilities. What could possibly be wrong with that? I know how that happens, because I do it all the time when I'm going from computer to phone audio. So here we go. This is how we get in trouble with reconciliation. We've got a fear, a value looked at from an "or" perspective, and now we've gotten hooked and stuck in reconciliation. Not because there's a problem with reconciliation, it's because we're not seeing the whole picture from an "and" perspective, and that's what causes the polarization. And so this flipping back and forth and blame and all that, just the polarization ends up just being wasted energy. It's like a power struggle between these poles. So how do we move forward with more courage and bravery and resilience? Because it's not going to be sustainable if you're flipping back and forth. So one way to do it is to differentiate what are the problems we need to solve and what are the polarities to leverage, map the polarities, then go after the greater purpose by getting the best of both upsides and avoiding the downsides as much as you can. You can't get rid of the tension, but if you can see it, the likelihood that you're going to be able to accelerate the relationship building and trust and healing process is exponentially higher than if you only see it from an or perspective, because it's the or that creates the polarization on the tension. So it's not what you're, well, that's probably good enough right there. So I'm actually very curious now to hear more wisdom from you around a question about what words or phrases come to mind for you about the impact of seeing and mapping truth and reconciliation to support healing in our communities. And you're going to give you 10 minutes here in the breakout, and the same game. You're going to choose someone to record or report who will share the themes in the chat when you get back. I would encourage you not to spend too much time on the introductions and everything, because there's not that much time. And this is a big question. So whenever we're ready to go, let's hit the breakout rooms. Back, everybody. I hope that you had a good breakout session. I can tell you I did. Wow. So here's the challenge right now. So I want you to put in the chat, please, because we can capture that for posterity, and then we can share it after the session. But I'm just looking at the time. I want to make sure we capture all your wisdom. So whoever the recorder was or reporter, please, get that stuff captured. But for right now, because I am so excited to introduce my colleague Chandra, but before I do, I've got one or two things I want to cover with you. And one is, it's kind of a gift, quite frankly. I'm just going to take a minute or two here. I'm going to rifle through this. I know it's going to be fast. So please forgive me for that in advance. But I want to share with you that because of the predictability of polarities, we can measure them, because what you can predict and what's predictable, you can measure, right? So we can actually look. And for those of you, I saw a couple of people like, yeah, I love measurement or predictability. So just so you know, we can assess the frequency of these experiences of the upsides and downsides. And so if we're almost never experiencing the upside, that's not a good thing. Like if I were to give you 0 points, if you were getting the upsides of those two poles, that wouldn't be a good thing. If you were almost always experiencing those things, that would be great. Now, notice in the downside, almost always would be a bad thing. So you'd get 0 points if you were almost always experiencing one or more of those downsides. But if you were almost never experiencing those downsides, that would be a pretty good thing, wouldn't you say? And so when you look at this infinity loop here that is superimposed on the map, what you're seeing is a maximization of the upsides and a minimization of the downsides. Now, I know you've probably been thinking, oh, I get what he's saying. You just need to balance these polarities. Actually, balance would be kind of sometimes getting the upsides and sometimes getting the downsides and sometimes getting the upsides and sometimes. That's not really like just kind of balancing. It's kind of like treading water. You got your head above water, but you're not really going anywhere. So leverage is really, it's not easy, but it's possible to do if you can see it and map it. One thing that helps us to do it better is to assess it. So I'm going to give you a link. I'm going to give you a link to an assessment that you all can take, and you're going to get results. And the results will be an internal assessment of how do you think you're doing truth and reconciliation in your community, and how's your community doing truth and reconciliation. And so you'll get 2 sets of results back. So essentially, I'm going to give you a link, and it's going to be to a survey. You can take it later after this session or tonight or whatever. And you can see that there are a couple different dimensions here. I do this, and then there's also, we, like we, and for the purposes of we, if you hover over these terms, you'll learn what we mean by we, or that kind of thing. So just take the survey, and I'm going to put this in the chat at the end, and so you don't need to capture it. But what's going to happen is you're going to get your result immediately. So these were my results. I took this morning, and this is how I came out. I took it really fast, so I mean, I don't know if these are exact results, but whatever. So these are the summary results of how well or poorly I'm leveraging the polarity. Now, the summary results don't really give us that much detail. When you go into the results, you can click on these green items here, these tabs, and the tabs will show you a well-leveraged loop, the polarity items you assess, the as-rated loop, and then the item scores. So just so you know here, and I'm gonna pretty much, coming in for a landing. I'm gonna turn this over to Chandra. This gray loop is the best you can get. You can click that on and off with the well-leveraged. This white loop, that's essentially your score. And what this score means is this is where you are compared to the highly leveraged loop. And so where do you get this 56 number? You just add 63 plus 63 plus 50 plus 50, divide by 4, and you got 56. So that's just, those are the basics on how to read, the results of a polarity map. You're assessing your performance based on your frequency of experience. It's not, I mean, we put this together so you would just have, just a sample of how one might assess and then learn from where they are, because it helps to know where you are before you try to figure out where you're going, right? So anyway, that's essentially the assessment here. And now I can't get my mouse back, so I'm going to there we go. Let me erase this. So you can see this would be the community version of the same thing. You just basically do the same. I mean, you read the results the same way. Okay. So you'll have 2 different maps, one for you, one for your community, based on your own self-assessment. And the bottom line is that what you want to do is, at the end of this process, is step 5. You want to start developing action steps. Action steps are the things that are going to give you the benefits of the upsides, and early warning signs keep you out of the downsides. I threw a couple of simple ones out there just because this was basically Margaret's story. Margaret engaged a group of key stakeholders in a dialogue process. They shared lessons learned and successes together. They measured their progress, and then they worked to keep themselves out of the downside. So with that, that's like the step 5. That's the strategy to leverage the polarity. But I think I've gone on long enough. I want to open this up for questions, and just tell you that it's possible to leverage these tensions, as difficult as they are. And I'm sure you'll see in the chat from some of the breakouts that, at least in my breakout, they are very challenging. So stop and sharing. And I'm now gonna turn this over to my wonderful friend and colleague, the most amazing person, as you'll see in a second, Chandra Irvin.
Thank you very much, Cliff. Because this is a Q&A, I'm going to let you begin. There are a couple of things I'd just like to share with you I think might be important to this process before you start to ask questions. One is having a shared greater purpose is very important when we're dealing with this notion of truth and reconciliation. And that is not to be assumed, but making sure you find that shared greater purpose is critical to the process. And once we get the shared greater purpose, it's pretty easy to find a shared deeper fear. Okay, what is it that we want, everybody wants to avoid? The other thing I'd like to share with you is that in the work that we've done over the years when doing this type of work, and especially when it comes to dealing with cultural issues, it becomes really important to pay attention not only to there's a key polarity in here. One of them has to do with, and this is one that you see that Margaret and we were really focused on there. And that was, how do we pay attention to not only what we're going to do and what, the transactional piece of this, but there was also the, how are we going to be? And so there was a transcendent part of it. And the transcendent part, was like, how, this helps us with our internal readiness, me as an individual, to figure out, why do I want to engage in this? And how am I going to sustain my engagement in it? And so that's the transcendent piece, the internal readiness to do the external work, to engage in those external remedies that keep us going. So that's a key polarity. And often what we do when we're doing this kind of thing, we start with what we normally do, and that is focus on the transactions. And that's a good thing, to focus on the transaction, but by themselves, they're not sustainable. They don't sustain us to transformation. So we keep doing this, keep having the same issues over and over again, and we wonder why we're not making any progress, not leveraging as Cliff was just talking about. And it's often because we're just focused on the transactional part. We're not looking at that deeper part of who I am, why am I here, how am I going to sustain my commitment to this when it gets really tough, etc. Okay, now your questions, please.
Hey, Chandra, I had a question in the chat directed to me that I'd like to, let's thank the person for sending it to me, but since this is your time, the question was, can you address the question of situational concerns, particularly with community, but is it also a real experience of individuals, quote, white lies or timing of sharing truth? So I will let the person who sent it to me clarify the question if they want to, or if you need clarification. But Chandra, as I shared that question that came to me, does anything jump out at you?
I'm not sure that I quite understand the question, so I don't want to start an explanation that might not be on target. If the person who asked the question would give us a little bit more information, I appreciate it.
Okay, Chandra, this is Diane. It was my question, and it comes off of the concept of situational leadership. In that leadership, it responds to a situation, and I was wondering if this model, particularly in the area of truth, has a point of view about situational approaches to truth, because underlying some of my community work is people that believe in, on an individual level many times, but at an organizational level, that truth is fungible. And that you can't even get the conversation started, because there are white lies that we live with. There is timing of sharing truth. That's some sort of secrecy. But at a community level, people don't have the same experience that develops their idea of what a common truth is. So they distrust the word truth.
Yeah, I agree that is my experience as well, that people don't share necessarily the same truth. And so for them, I think of it as realities. And I think of it in terms of there's a subjective reality that's mine, and then there's the objective reality. And so when dealing with, that conflict between those two, and both of them I think are important to bring to the table. We seek to find out, okay, what is everybody's subjective reality first, because that is what's going to be most, probably most poignant for them. And for those who find that objective reality to be most poignant for them, we want to know what that is. And then we kind of go through a process similar to what Margaret described, very similar to what Margaret described earlier. And that is to let everybody see their subjective and objective realities there. See if that really is on target with where they are. And that's really, really important. That's why seeing is number one, because they need to be able to see their perspective represented. And then go from there to find out, okay, well now given this, what is the shared, where do we find any shared value, shared purpose? Does that help, Diane?
Yes, that gives me some operational way of handling the thought. And could you comment on the situational part? Are these principles situational, other than the point of view you just shared, which is everybody comes to the table with what their definition is to them, and you work from that. Mm-hmm. But is the concept of this situational, in that you allow people to have different proofs for different situations?
The
part of the real, sorry, go ahead. I'm fine.
Yeah, so maybe we could just build on each other. Cliff, I would say the principles of this are the same, and they transfer across situations. However, they are applied differently in different situations. Would you all agree, Margaret and Cliff, to that?
Exactly what I was going to say. There's a real versatility to the approach, because what you'd be doing in Detroit might be different from Berkeley Springs, West Virginia, might be different from any of your communities. But the approach, there's a process and a structure to the approach that is part of a values and language clarification process that gets the same end result, which is people seeing each other more completely and seeing themselves more completely in these tensions. And that happens when you unpack the language through the mapping process and through the long, hard work. I mean, let's loop back to Margaret's story. Think about all those listening sessions in Charleston. Think about the history in Charleston. Think about, what just happened in Charleston. Someone trying to start a race war. Think about all of that's coming together in this situation, and they're trying to deal with it. Another community might not have that exact situation, but the process can be used the same way. And there's a power in that, just in and of itself.
I would ask for another question, but I think we're at 2:30, a little bit back.
I think we're at time, yeah. That was a lot. Thank you all for your engagement. I was amazed with what I saw in the chat, and it's so clear to me that you all are, you get it at a DNA visceral level. So I hope it wasn't too much content, but we wanted to give you as much as we could in the time we had. So I'll turn this back to you. Who?
Yeah, it's Lyndon here. I'll just say a word of thanks. So at the outset, I perhaps promised people that they'd encounter a really powerful model, and I hope that's been your experience today. My thanks to Margaret, Cliff, and Chandra for illuminating this process to us today. And as you might guess, that there is a lot of detail to this, a lot more to understand and tools to be used. And I think Joel mentioned at the start that they're exploring whether the Leadership Forum could offer a learning opportunity to learn how to use these tools, because they're powerful. They can be used in our organizations, not only communities, but also in our own personal lives with our families, where these tensions show up all the time. So thanks again to our presenters, and hope to continue to build on what we've had this morning and this afternoon with great sessions. Thanks all.